So we're not saying, and we're not challenging the state's legitimacy to use violence against us. In a discussion such as peace building, we really need to have those discussions. We really need to challenge whether or not these countries and whether or not these areas around the world need to have guns. One of the interviewees said, basically this is the attitude that pacifism and nonviolent talks are sort of regarded with is that it's just not viable. We're not really going to talk about it because it's unrealistic, which is a shame and, to me, not very critical. So, alternatives and imagination. Just trying to regain my train of thought, so I'll just go back here. Okay, so basically, what is missing here? So critiques of the international order, they're very, very slim, unnuanced, and they normally just bring in or link arguments to bigger stuff. And I mean, people like Mike Pugh and things that really engage with these sorts of discussions, they don't look at the micro factors, so they're focused on the big macro discussions. Everyone else is focused on the micro factors, and there's no link between the two. No one's really bringing those together. Same with critiques of the objectives of peace building. Very little discussion of what type of peace we're trying to produce. So many articles will talk about we need to have a more durable peace or a more sustainable peace, but they don't actually bother to say what that peace is. Is it a different peace to the peace that we're trying to create, which is often called a liberal peace? Or is it the same piece but just manufactured differently so it lasts longer? These sorts of questions aren't normally engaged with or had. Critiques of the state, as I said already, they don't really happen, and they're intrinsically linked to critiques of violence. And neither of those things are really challenged, and no new things are sort of put forward, as with environment and land rights. So what sort of alternatives have people put forward, and what sort of things have we imagined that we can produce or create in peace building instead? Like if these countries keep fighting each other and it's all their fault, which peace building might suggest, then why don't we create a different type of country? Why don't we create a different political community? This sort of narrative is part of the local turn. So the local turn that happened sort of 1997, John Paul Lederach wrote this book about the need for bottom-up approaches to peace building. And in the 2000s, that was adopted in what we call the local turn, which is this need to engage with the local societies and citizens and people, and not do top-down peace building where we come in and we tell them how their peace should look, how their state should look, but allow them to create that instead, which was fantastic because it makes sense. The problem is that, well, to me the problem is that if we're trying to create a new type of state or a new type of peace, by going into these countries and telling them to come up with the whole thing, I wonder whether or not we're being lazy. Because we're not being imaginative, we're just using them and telling them to say, hey, this is what we want, this is what we want it to look like. The issue is, as noted by scholars like David Chandler, is that we just keep going deeper and deeper into the societal level. We open up the private space, and we put civil society organizations and NGOs and everything in there to monitor and look after them and help them to develop notions of what a state is or what a democracy is, to be watchdogs. An author, Campbell, wrote about this phenomenon in Cambodia, where civil society organizations were coaching local societies and people into how to be part of the international, so that now that the top-down wasn't working that well and we couldn't tell the state what to do, we could encourage it from the bottom up, but it was still this understanding of our Western notion of what peace is or what society is or what the state is. It wasn't like that in all the literature, but it's certainly something that has been milked to death. In terms of alternative types of peace, well, we have what's called the hybrid peace, which is really just a way of saying it's kind of like our peace but different. It doesn't have all the tenets. It's like a liberal peace 2.0, but maybe it's not 2.0, maybe it's 1.5, because typically we don't actually see it as that much better. There's a everyday peace, which is the understanding of peace as it exists and is practice between people on the everyday level, so not at the state level or societal level, but within people, within communities, which is positive, but it's not prescriptive, it's descriptive. Post-liberal peace has been most put forward by a scholar named Oliver Richmond, and he essentially has sort of 10 or 12 talking points, which are these imaginative things which look very sort of socialist, and I mean they're all good, but they could just as easily be reflected back onto the Western state or the Western society, which he never bothers to do in any of his writing. So it's still a piece for the post-conflict other, not a piece for us. When I spoke to academics about who is coming up with this new piece, who's coming up with this new state, the sort of response I tended to get was we thought Richmond was doing it. Everyone sort of assumed that this scholar, because he is prolific in the field, out of the 600 articles he had written 70 of them, which was very frustrating to read. But basically, when I asked him about it, he said he wasn't doing it. You know, he was creating a new episteme, a new way of thinking, a new way of challenging, but he wasn't creating a new piece. That was the next step. Other people had to do that. But no one was, because everyone thought he was doing it. So it was this real weird cycle where everyone just misinterpreted what he was doing and what he was trying to do. And he said that he never actually intended it to turn out that way anyway. And the same French scholar that said I'm arrogant and have all the answers, she said, no one has put forward an alternative. We don't have one, and it's a big problem. Why I'm not doing my PhD on that is because I am very hypocritical, as we'll see. This entire thing applies to me. Unimaginative, uncritical, useless. Reflexivity. This is probably one of my primary interest points, was looking at all these little elements of critique, the state, violence, all that sort of stuff. How often do we reflect it back onto our own system? How often do we challenge ourselves, the states that we live in? One scholar told me that academics aren't reflective upon their work, and it's probably not fair to ask them to be. I disagree with wholeheartedly. I think academics should be reflective on their work, because if we're continually coming up with solutions and suggestions and understandings of what the other is doing, those should be applicable to us as well. Critiques of the post-conflict country's economy or corruption and things like that make no sense unless we're taking into account the broader international system factors that are allowing for it. To say that Sri Lanka keeps having these civil wars and human rights abuses when Sweden was selling, it was one of the top 10 manufacturers of arms till 2011. Since then it has been reduced slightly, and they've stopped selling guns to Sri Lanka, but a lot of their guns were involved in the Sri Lankan Civil War. In my data set, one author mentioned it, and it was very neutral. It didn't necessarily mention Sweden by name. In a book outside of academia that was written through a peace and conflict society, she challenged the role of sort of the big powers in supporting guns and arms trade. But how can we talk about violence without talking about arms trade? How can we talk about corruption of elites within a post-conflict society without saying, well, we created a banking and financial system which allows them to just transfer all the money out that belongs to their country? In fact, how can we complain about the elites within these countries when the Panama Papers were released and we all know how much tax evasion is going on within our own societies? And to sort of just ignore these things and sort of talk about them as if they're a post-conflict entity, as in they only occur to the other, they only occur to the state, is not only unreflexive, it's just stupid, because we're never really going to address the bigger problems and we're never really going to be able to stop them. So the lack of reflection on ourselves, this sort of notion that the liberal peace is fine for me, it's just not fine for others. So challenges to the liberal peace have always been about challenging the post-conflict reconstruction of liberal peace, and there's very little reflection on whether or not we need to change how that works in our society as well. But that probably wasn't too convincing, so we can come back to it later in the discussion time. Cyclical nature of debate. So one of the big things that I kept coming across is this notion that hybridity, the concept of hybridity, keeps getting misused. So I tried to trace it through the citation network analysis to find out how is it being misused and where is it being misused. I started with a text in 2015 by Oliver Richmond and Roger McGinty saying it keeps getting misused, it keeps getting prescribed. And they quoted Gerald Miller and Jenny Jenny Peterson. And so I followed those texts, and they say, oh, well, they're all critique. Other people are misusing it as well. And some people seem to reference Miller, saying that he was misusing it. Anyway, everyone was just blaming everyone else. I got down to the end point of it was this 2011 World Bank document, which mentioned hybridity 0 times or 1 time, can't remember, it doesn't matter, 0 times or 1 time, it's pretty negligible. And everyone was using that as evidence that hybridity had been misused. Now, hybridity has been misused, but I really think that the academics were the ones that were misusing it, and they were just continually conflating the different interpretations, one that came out of Australia, one that came out of the UK, and one that came out of Scandinavia, all at the same time, running around in circles, telling each other off about how badly they were using it, but not realizing that they had brought the terms together themselves within their text. So that was a very cyclical debate, and there's this really great example. This Scandinavians, they released a special edition in 2012 about what hybrid political orders are. They've been accused of poaching the term by some scholars, but essentially they created this notion of hybrid peace governance. Hybrid political orders was Australia. So very, very similar. One was normative, the one in Australia. One wasn't, the one in Sweden. They released that. It didn't get much fanfare. The people that cited it the most were the people that actually released it, and it was cited the most in the follow-up edition the next year on friction, which is an expanded version of hybrid peace governance. So cyclical debates happen, but they're even worse when you start looking at outside of the discipline of peace and conflict studies. Notions like hybridity weren't invented within peace and conflict studies. They're most often attributed to scholars within the post-colonial discourses. So this one scholar, Baba, who McGinty said I can quote him on this, writes like shit, and you just can't understand him, it's a pretty accurate sort of